is the Mississippi John Hurt song Satisfied and Tickled Too. I'm using that song to start off today to show you the difference between what I hear and see as the difference between classical style finger picking, folk style finger picking, and blues style finger picking. I have no doubt that Mississippi John Hurt influenced a whole generation of folk style finger pickers. He was playing in New York in the late 50s, early 60s when the whole Bob Dylan Greenwich Village folk scene was exploding, and I think that he really was, he influenced, when I hear finger pickers in the folk realm from then and today, I hear his influence heavily. However, one thing I think that's missing from the folk style is a muted percussive bass. In a song like Satisfied and Tickled Too, which are basically just three chords, F, C, and G. A folk player would play this probably by posting their finger on the surface of the guitar, or if not, using a classical style hand position, which is to not have any fingers touching the top of the guitar. So in other words, let me turn sideways. So I'd have my hand more like this, whereas a folk player, some folk players would plant their pinky, but a blues player would actually have their palm resting on the bass strings of the guitar. And the reason for this is so that they could get a percussive bass. This, most of John Hurt's tunes used an alternating bass going between two strings. In this case, we're doing the F chord and I'm going between the 6 and the 4 string. Now if I was more of a folk player, notice I'm not muting the bass. And this is where I think the sort of major differences between two worlds of music are go in different directions. They have the sort of Western European influence on melody, and folk is lots of nice pretty melodies. But then there's the West African tradition of more emphasis on rhythm. And something I've always tried to emulate in my guitar playing is that idea of the percussive bass with the melodic lines played on, for the most part, the top 3 strings. Now I use John Hurt as an example because, like I say, I think a lot of folk players were influenced by John Hurt. And you can play John Hurt songs because they're very pretty without having to mute the bass, and they sound great. But let's take a song like Big Bill Broonzy's Hey Hey, which is a single string bass note. Very percussive bass, muted bass. My palm, again, is laying right on the bass strings. And the way I hold my hand, I'm curling my fingers, so this allows my fingers to come up off of the treble strings. I don't know if you can see that very well, but my treble strings are allowed to ring. And this really gives the sound of two separate instruments, a percussive bass where the note just dies, it doesn't sustain. And the melody notes, or the treble notes, which are allowed to sustain. that bass part is so emphasized and so heavy that a player like Big Bill Brunsey, and you can see this on a YouTube video, he'll brush, he's brushing through 2, 3 strings. But you don't hear, you hear, and that sounds like a drum. It's a real rhythmic drum sounding. If I didn't mute the bass, it sounds a little muddy. It doesn't have quite the drive. So that's important, I think, when you're playing fingerstyle blues, to be able to mute the bass. My general rule of thumb, no pun intended, is that when you're playing slow, you mute less. And when you're playing faster, you mute more. So dance tunes, I think, which are more up-tempo, you're going to mute more on the bass, but you're going to hit the bass harder. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but you know, you really want to get the drive of the song by hitting the bass hard, but muting it so it decays very quickly. And then the treble is allowed to ring. So I think that's important in blues fingerstyle playing. Folk playing, more emphasis on melody, less emphasis on rhythm, and so a less muted bass is fine. And classical playing, of course, is a very different style altogether. I am not a classical guitar player by any stretch of the imagination. I never played classical, so. But as I watch and hear and see players, this is the thing I've noticed, that some people who come to me for lessons from a classical background have their hand out here, and I have to spend some time with them to get them to actually put their palms on the bass strings of the guitar so they can get that percussive bass. So, very important thing to remember. Thanks for listening and checking in. Take care.